But I'm really excited to hold this event today. When we founded Migration Policy Scotland, it was because we were aware of the need for more capacity on migration policy in Scotland outside refugee and asylum migration. Particularly also because of the cross-cutting nature of the issues it impacted, and in relation to that, migration's impact on population and rural areas in Scotland was one of those issues that felt always like it wasn't an issue of great prominence in Scotland, but not so much in the UK migration policy debate. And so our purpose is not only to bridge research and policy in a way that we're trialing today, or by bringing this a very focused discussion that also showcases a particular piece of research, but also to try and improve the connections and conversations that are happening around migration issues that are particularly relevant in Scotland. So I'm delighted that the first one of these we are doing on a project on rural lives, and for research that looks at those issues, and to have Emilia's work to focus on, but also to have my new colleague, senior researcher Rebecca Kay, to work with on these issues. Rebecca brings a wealth of experience to MPS, both in terms of her research on migration in Scotland and also across Scotland, but also her experience as the chair of the Scottish Government's Independent Expert Advisory Group on Migration and Population. And it's been timely this week to see proposals on rural visa pilots coming from that work, with the Scottish Government having made proposals earlier this week. And it's certainly an area of work where we would like to be doing further work, and where we see a role for an organisation like MPS to act as a connecting organisation between the really good work that's getting off the ground, that has been going on for some time, but to try to facilitate the conversations between what can often be quite discrete and disjointed areas of work, and hopefully adding value in that way. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca to introduce the panel today.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah, and I'm really excited about today's event. It feels extremely timely, as Sarah was just saying, given that debate in the Scottish Parliament earlier this week, but also the recent publication of NRS data on Scotland's population, and the many local initiatives that are underway exploring place-based approaches to population concern. So this event offers an opportunity to discuss the relationship between migration and broader concerns linked to population, economic and community development in rural Scotland. And our first panel of experts have been asked to reflect on this and to provide more context around current policy concerns and priorities regarding rural populations, around challenges in attracting and retaining rural populations, and about the future of policy for Scotland's rural populations. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first pair of speakers, and I'm delighted to welcome Mike Andrews, the population team leader, and Ben Jones, Deputy Population Programme Manager, both within the Scottish Government's Directorate for External Affairs. Their team oversees the delivery of Scotland's population strategy, which was published in March 2021, and they'll talk today about the strategic policy context for addressing rural population challenges. So over to you, Mike, and if you want to start sharing your screen, then that would be grand. And as Sarah said, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat, and we will bring them together at the end of the panel. Okay, over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Becca. Thanks very much, Sarah. Just to double check, you can see a slide appearing okay now? Perfect, perfect. Lovely to virtually meet all of you today. I noticed some familiar names joining the room, but a load I didn't recognise, so that's really good. Yeah, as Becca said, I'm the population team leader within Scottish Government, and really welcome the opportunity today to talk to you a little bit in a kind of high-level fashion about where we're at strategically with population work, and then dig into a little bit of detail about development work we're doing in the policy space at the moment. Contextually, I think some of this has already, I suppose, been covered, but Scotland is facing a number of long-term demographic challenges at the moment. We have an ageing population, a declining birth rate, an uncertain future on migration, and spatial population imbalances as well. So as part of that, many of our island and rural communities in particular are experiencing acute depopulation and population ageing simultaneously. So to address these and a wide range of other challenges relating to population in Scotland's demography, Scottish Government published our first National Population Strategy last year, which is overseen by the Ministerial Population Task Force. That comprises more than 10 ministers across a very wide range of Scottish Government devolved responsibility, and the aim of that is to be able to, the aim of the task force is to bring ministerial interests together in order to make communities across Scotland more attractive places to live, work, bring up families and move to. In delivering the population strategy, which I mentioned, we run that as a kind of programme function within our team, and it's a cross-cutting programme of work focused on Scotland's demographic challenges. There are 4 key pillars to that strategy and the work that we're doing underneath that. That is to make Scotland as attractive and welcoming a place as possible, to ensure it's a family-friendly place, the best place to have and bring up kids, ensure it's a healthy living society in the context of Scotland's population living longer, and then there's a final pillar in that space is around Scotland with a more balanced population spatially. Now, this is, I suppose, the bit that predominantly leans into the key focus area around rural and island population concerns, which is obviously the focus for much of today's discussion. The kind of overall space, though, is split between devolved and reserved levers, and the kind of the powers that lie in different parliaments, I suppose, in order to address these concerns. So we have planning, housing, infrastructure, connectivity, jobs, all vital and led predominantly within the kind of discretely Scottish context, but then we have reserved levers as well, in particular immigration, also particularly key to discussions in this space. So that's, I suppose, a little bit of an overview of the policy context which we find ourselves within, and I suppose that the strategy document, if you haven't seen it, is something well worth reading to understand what's underpinning much of our work. I think today we wanted to give a little bit of focus to 2 key pieces of work. One Sarah mentioned in initial comments, and that's the rural visa pilot proposal, and then after that I'm going to pass to Ben to talk about a piece of work which is very much earlier stage development, and that's around our Addressing Depopulation Action Plan, which some of you will have heard of. So just to give a little bit of an oversight to the work on the rural visa pilot proposal, as Sarah said, it's been an awfully big week for that piece of work, but the genesis of that comes predominantly from a view expressed by the UK Government's Migration Advisory Committee back in 2019. In their report of May 2019, they recommended the UK Government pilot a scheme to attract and retain migrants in remote areas, and highlighted that the current immigration system was not very effective in facilitating migration to remote areas. The then Home Secretary accepted that proposal, but we have since politically, I suppose you would say, hit a brick wall in terms of the people that have been in and around the Home Office since that time, under the kind of Boris Johnson administration. However, regardless of that, there was a commitment made in the 2021 programme for government to develop a kind of substantive workable proposal in the context of rural visa pilots, and that's been developed predominantly through 2022 led by Scottish Government, but in the form of a short life working group where we've had really good input from members of the expert advisory group, including Becca and others, and then also local authorities and key business partners as well. It's been a really good experience, I suppose, in terms of being able to use the views and priorities of local communities and community organisations in reflecting what forms a finished proposal, which we published this week. The proposal itself calls for the establishment of what we've called a Scottish Rural Community Immigration Pilot, and that pilot would represent a completely new community-driven approach to local migration in Scotland and is modelled on successful immigration schemes which have been delivered in Canada. It would intend to allow remote and rural communities to attract migrants in line with distinct needs that they've identified, and would include an integrated settlement support package as well to incoming migrants. And so in that regard, the aim of the scheme is to promote and support long-term integration within our remote, rural and island communities. Through the process, ministers were very, very clear that what they wanted was to be led by the views and needs of these affected communities, and the end result of that, we think, is a proposal which is strongly supported by a range of kind of key stakeholders who ultimately would be involved in delivering such a scheme. Just by way of a couple of examples, the chair of Scottish Rural Action has said that they've been encouraged to see that the proposal has been designed to reflect the needs of individual communities, and Shetland Council have commented that the proposed rural visa pilot will recognise the pressing need for bespoke measures to address these challenges in rural areas. So with that kind of groundswell of support, we're in a position now to have launched this proposal publicly this week, and it was endorsed by a clear majority in the Scottish Parliament on Tuesday, following its publication earlier that day. So in doing so, I suppose the Parliament's demonstrated a strong majority view towards Scotland having differentiated immigration levers at its disposal where relevant for the needs of communities. So where we're at just now with that piece of work is that we have submitted that from Marie Goujon, the Rural Affairs Secretary, to the new Home Secretary, who came into post just a couple of weeks ago, and we've requested that the UK Government works with Scottish Government and local partners to establish and deliver the scheme. I think crucially, it's worth stressing that we've at no stage missed off the and local partners part. That's been key to, I suppose, the perspective that the proposal puts forward. It's very, very much about what communities want and need versus it being explicitly political. And I think that speaks to the strength of the proposal. In terms of next steps, well, we wait to see what the UK Government says about it. There have been early press comments from Home Office, but nothing formal back from the Home Office. So we wait to see what that looks like. And in the meantime, we'll look to engage the proposal with a range of audiences. We're looking to probably speak with the Migration Advisory Committee in more detail, other devolved administrations, and continue to build a bit of momentum around the proposal. But yeah, to come back to the earlier comment, it's been an awfully big promotive week for what's been a chunky piece of work in the name of Scotland's communities over the past 6 to 9 months. I'm going to pause there, but look to bring my colleague Ben Jones in, who is going to speak about a piece of work which is nowhere near as evolved as this, but promises to be really interesting in the next little while. So I'm going to move this slide on and bring you in, Ben.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully what Mike has said has given a flavour of, as he's alluded to, a project which is has just matured and one that we're really, really excited about, and looking forward to see how it lands and where we can take it next. I'm going to talk a little bit about an emerging commitment that Scottish ministers have made, which is really relevant in this space of retaining rural populations, and that's around an addressing depopulation action plan, which the Cabinet Secretary for Rural and Island Affairs, Marie Goujon, announced back in March 2022, which would build upon the existing population strategy, which was published in 2021, but also the National Islands Plan. This would be led again by the cross-cutting ministerial population task force, and I suppose what's significant about that is precisely some of the points that have already come out already when we're talking about retaining rural populations. The conversation is about migration, but I think as Sarah said really well, it's also about many other levers and many other factors, and that is at the heart of that recognition is at the heart of our cross-ministerial population task force, and we hope will be at the heart of the development of this action plan as it grows and continues. In terms of what that will look like, how it grows and how it will continue, we're looking to build on the existing routes of engagement that we've got in place, whether that be through COSLA, whether that be through with local authorities or through regional forums like the Convention of the Highlands and Islands or Convention of South of Scotland. But we're also really keen to continue to build really strong partnerships between the policy work that we're doing and the research community, whether that be the Independent Expert Advisory Group, which Becca chairs, or experts that we know from other institutions that are working in this space and doing some really fantastic work. In such a large delivery landscape, and you know, we're quite clear that we are very clearly not starting with a blank page. There is so much good work going on in this space already across housing and planning and transport and the rural and islands portfolios and at local level. This is really going to be an exercise about being careful about how we can add contributions in the right places to help support the retention and attraction of people in communities facing these really complex challenges. We've already established a policy testing work stream, and Mike's given a flavour of the rural visa pilot proposal, and that is certainly one element of that. But over the next year, our task force is going to be looking to drive forward the action plan, looking to identify gaps across portfolios, looking to test new interventions where we can, learning from new research and particularly learning from international contexts is a key priority for us, as well, as we're really aware that other countries are facing very similar challenges and around kind of rural populations and island populations, and what can we learn there. And there's been some movement in that space in recent months with some really interesting work coming out. But perhaps the most important thing, and before I kind of close, is that we continue to take a partnership approach as best as we can. And the recognition of our task force is that these things are all interlinked and portfolios need to talk to each other. So whether that be at the government level or whether that be at the interfaces between different organisations at national and regional and local and community level, because ultimately one of the key findings that we've had from recent work and including the recent Islands Bond consultation is that, you know, the importance of listening to communities and doing things with communities and policies with communities, and I think that's hopefully threading through the rural visa pilot proposal that we've published this week. But back to this work in terms of our timescales for this, we'd look to be publishing this in 2023. Oh, I'm nearly done. So in terms of timescales, yes, the aims would be to publish this action plan in 2023. But between now and then, we hope a whole load of engagement, a whole load of listening to people with really, really good ideas about where things could be improved and where things in the policy space, and we look forward to having those conversations. And hopefully this is one example of where we can do that. So I'll pause there and hand back. Is it to Becca or to Sarah? Thanks.
So the next input is from two colleagues from the James Hutton Institute, Ruth Wilson, who is a postdoctoral social scientist in social, economic and geographical sciences, working on projects relating to demographic change in rural and island areas, and John Hopkins, who's a geographer whose work explores the diversity of socioeconomic development and demographic changes across Scotland, as well as assessing processes of adaptation and change in rural areas. And Jane Atterton of the Rural Policy Centre at Scotland's Rural College who unfortunately can't join us this morning, has also contributed to developing this presentation. So really keen to hear it. I think Ruth has had some problems with her camera this morning, so unfortunately we can't. Oh, we can see you now, Ruth, or at least I can.
Yes,
so that's
I'm
great.
back.
So I'll hand over now to Ruth and John.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. It's really nice to be here. So this is going to be a joint presentation between me and John. As Becca says, unfortunately, Jane can't be here this morning, but I'm sure she'll be happy to discuss any points offline. John is going to begin by summarising some of his work on sparsely populated areas, and then I'll pick up and outline some of our other work on rural and island repopulation. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everybody. As Ruth says, for our research on demographic change in remote areas, we've used the geographical definition of sparsely populated areas, or SPAs for short, as a kind of lens for this analysis. And so this builds on a definition which has been produced at a research institute in Sweden called Nordregio, which was about 15 years ago that was developed. Sparsely populated areas are defined as such because they have a low population potential, or what we mean a small number of people living in nearby areas. So the Scottish Urban Rural Classification defines remoteness as poor access to large towns and cities. This definition is slightly different. It relates to poor access to people overall, which presents particular challenges for maintaining communities. And the pink area on the map shows where the sparsely populated areas in Scotland are. It's worth noting that this definition was based on data zones and was produced in 2020. The earlier research, which was led by Andrew Copus, used an earlier definition of this. And so sparsely populated areas are data zones where we estimate that less than 10,000 people lived within 30 minutes, corresponding to the definitions of urban areas size and accessible travel times used in the Urban Rural Classification. The sparsely populated areas are 41% of the country by area. They're distributed, as you can see, across islands and across the mainland, in coastal and inland regions. And it's notable that some larger towns in remote areas, Stornoway, Fort William, and others, are not sparsely populated themselves. We can see that these have lost population since 2001 of about 2.5%. This is a period when Scotland as a whole has grown in population, and they have a notably imbalanced population structure compared with other regions. So in 2018, there were 68.8 older people and children for every 100 people of working age in sparsely populated areas. And the comparison figure for the Central Belt, Aberdeen and Dundee as a whole is 49.8 in terms of dependency ratio. And it's challenging to produce population projections for a custom defined area like sparsely populated areas, which sits across many councils and boundaries. Andrew Copus used a specialist model which he developed to generate population projections and migration requirements for the sparsely populated areas. They were published in 2018, and our subsequent modelling uses more recent population estimates, very much drawing on the great work that Andrew did when he was running these projects. So we can project future populations at the level of subregions across Scotland using detailed population structures and applying assumptions of fertility rates, birth rates and death rates, and net migration using age, sex and local authority specific data when we can. Projections like these are not a definitive view of the future. That's very important to emphasize. They're an estimate which is based on assumptions, including future migration rates, which we assume use data based on recent trends. However, when we consider the period 2018 to 2043, projections show that the sparse populated areas are projected to lose more than 18% of their population and over 25% of their working age population. So these are obviously far more negative projections than in other regions, although, as we know, Scotland as a whole is facing demographic challenges. The population imbalance in the SPA grows in the same period. So in 2043, the forecast suggests there'll be about 84 older people and children for every 100 people of working age, and about 59 older people for every 100 people of working age. And so these types of demographic challenges will be familiar to many people here. And so a key question is how we can best inform policy responses to manage these, and understanding how the potential implications of changing migration patterns may well be a part of this. And so this is just to introduce some work which has been developed by myself and drawing on the expertise of my colleague Simone Pires at the James Hutton Institute. So we produced an alternative modelling of future migration patterns based on regional employment changes using industry sector level data from 2004 to 18 and incorporated these into the population projections. So the labour that's required to meet future employment demand is calculated, and that which can't be met locally is distributed based on the location of that demand. And so producing these alternative migration metrics are informed by the fact that the SPAs are diverse in terms of the contributions of different industries to employment and the strengths of links to workplaces in other areas. These are likely to create differences in economic development across the region. There's a number of uncertainties and assumptions in this modelling. So we make assumptions about the household structures of immigrants to the areas and their age structures. And there's issues with the resolution and the estimation of input data sets in employment. But this method creates projections of potential populations, which can be thought of as an unlikely best case scenario if no barriers to labour availability or no barriers to migration existed. And for sparsely populated areas, the projected potential population in 2043 is 6.5% higher than the population level in 2018. So while we have to acknowledge the limitations and uncertainty of this method, it's very possible that some parts of Scotland's SPAs have potential for demographic recovery, which isn't currently being realised. However, it may be the case that more balanced population structures are harder to achieve than population stability or growth. And that's a link to a publication which has just been made available by myself, Simone Pires, and Gunit Kapoor here at the Hutton. And just as a last summary from me before handing over to Ruth, differences in the optimism of population projections and the scale of demographic challenges exist within the SPA. So the map on the left of this slide shows the SPA boundaries in thicker boundaries, and the population projections are based on past migration. And you can see that there is variation across the SPA. There's more positive projected trends in the Northern Islands and in Highlands, and more negative projections for the south and southwest of Scotland. And this issue of variation and differences within regions is something which I believe Ruth is going to expand on now. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, John. So when we drill down further still, we find places that appear to be defying trends, but which are not necessarily showing up in official statistics because the data are not current or not fine-grained enough to reflect change in small places. We saw this in the Island Revival project funded by Safari in 2019, in which residents of several of Scotland's islands shared evidence of population turnaround or green shoots of change. We learned that the island of Kerala, for example, saw a 100% increase in the number of full-time residents between 2011 and 2019, from 34 to 68, including 19 children. And it's really important that we pay attention to these examples to learn about what might work elsewhere. Next slide, please, John. So what can we do? Populations change in very slow cycles. Fertility and mortality rates can't easily be changed. And we're currently experiencing the legacy of past outward migration. The only viable lever for increasing population levels in parts of Scotland that are currently sparsely populated is by increasing net migration. There is an appetite to live in these areas, including among younger people who have moved away and would like to return. Arguably, COVID-19 has presented an opportunity to stimulate migration. Interviews we conducted with rural stakeholders during lockdown showed some positivity about the potential to help young people to return through remote or hybrid working, which has become normalised in some sectors and which opens up possibilities for undertaking professional work from home. However, there are barriers to realising this. Only a quarter of respondents to the 2020 National Islands Plan survey, which John and I led, felt that young people under 40 are supported to remain in, move into, or return to the local area. And less than a third of respondents agreed that it's easy for young people who want to live in and work in their local area to do so. And the data reveal that respondents feel there's a lack of employment, training and higher education opportunities, and a lack of childcare options to fit with residents' working patterns. There was felt to be a poor variety of housing types, sizes and tenures to meet people's needs, and a lack of affordable housing. Respondents also had very mixed experiences of digital connectivity. And these challenges are by no means confined to islands, and they need to be addressed in the round. So jobs alone or housing alone is not going to be enough. It's also important to recognise that for some communities, the goal is not necessarily growth, but rather to sustain current population levels and improve their viability. And the work of communities to tread water in this respect can take a great deal of effort without necessarily delivering headline figures. Communities' capacity to keep developing and seeking funding for initiatives and projects to help them address issues at the local level is certainly something to be considered. Next slide, please, John. We can also learn in Scotland from what is being tried elsewhere. SRUC researchers working with colleagues at Newcastle University, Akita International University and Tokyo University of Agriculture and Technology have recently completed a study for the Scottish Government exploring national and local level approaches to tackling island depopulation in Japan. While there are significant differences between Scotland and Japan, not least in terms of culture, attitudes, for example, to older generations and to rural living, and in terms of overall population trends, there's much that can be learned from this international comparative work. For example, Japan's concept of parallel working, where people live and work in both rural and urban locations, supported by IT, has applicability here given the shift to hybrid working associated with COVID. They also offer introduction, matching and experience services for urban residents who may be considering moving to rural locations. Their community cooperative support initiative provides a stipend for people wishing to move to rural and island locations to engage in local cultural or historical activities. And the concept of relationship population seeks to build stronger people-place relationships for those who visit rural and island areas frequently with a view to them migrating. Exploring initiatives like these elsewhere brings new learning and a deeper understanding of what could work in our own local context. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. In terms of future work, we have some new research funded by the Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme on the theme of rural futures, which includes projects on the rural economy, rural communities and land reform. Repopulation is going to be a focus of this work, and at Hutton we'll be working in depth with a number of communities across Scotland over the 5 years of the programme to understand the challenges on the ground and to link communities to policymakers to try to achieve change in real time, and also to learn lessons for other parts of Scotland. So we're really looking forward to playing a more active role in addressing these issues than we have done in the past. We'll also be working towards improving open spatial evidence of rural assets and rural development, and employing some new research methods, including behavioural experiments. SRUC is taking an issue-based approach to the 3 topics, that's rural economy, rural communities and land reform, and they'll be exploring demographic decline and outmigration as one of the persistent challenges facing rural and island communities through extensive revisiting of statistical, qualitative, citizen science and international evidence, and offering new policy suggestions in the light of current and future opportunities and challenges, including net zero, green recovery, biodiversity emergency, changing mobilities and connectivities, and impacts of Brexit. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions later on.
So last but certainly not least, I would like to pass over to Catherine MacNeil, who is Research Manager at Highlands and Islands Enterprise, leading on the design and delivery of HIE's research programme. Her presentation will focus on the findings of the research HIE has recently completed, My Life in the Highlands and Islands, which gathered insight from around 5,300 regional residents about issues of importance to local communities. And so we're moving nicely to that local community focus that both Mike and Ben and Ruth and John have highlighted is so important. Over to you, Catherine.
Good morning all, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this today. I'm presenting the findings of research that it's yet to be published. We're hoping to publish in the next week or two. And as Sarah said, it presents the views from the communities themselves on a range of policy issues. So I just want to start by reflecting on a couple of strategies. National Strategy for Economic Transformation has a strong regional dimension, and it includes a recognition that societal and structural economic inequalities need to be addressed across all parts of Scotland to bring transformational change. And prior to that, the COVID recovery strategy recognised that societal inequalities had been exacerbated by the pandemic, and that the foundations of recovery need to build on what people, families, businesses and communities perceive as priorities. So with that in mind, I decided to undertake a study just to understand the inequalities and understand what it is that our communities perceive as priorities. So essentially it was a large scale survey of adults over the age of 16 across the Highlands and Islands. We secured over 5,300 responses from over 4,400 households, and it was a push to web methodology. Just to look at some of the findings, some of the areas that we covered. The draft national planning framework, which sets out the spatial plan for Scotland 2045, is currently being finalised. One of the key principles underpinning the draft documentation relates to local living. So that's the creation of 20-minute neighbourhoods, and I'm sure many of you have heard much about that. We wanted to explore what that actually looks like from the rural perspective. As you might expect, access to basic services, core services is relatively good within 20-minute walk, and certainly within a 20-minute drive. But as we look at broader services, then access is really quite variable, even when we look at that 20-minute drive time. We also know, if we look at data from the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, that high proportions of data zones in the Highlands and Islands are already in the lowest 5% of data zones ranked according to the access to services domain of the SIMD. So we already have poor and worsening access to services generally. And it's hard to see how the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods will work in a rural setting. If we look at health, access to health services, the inequalities are stark. And even if we consider the 20-minute drive time, then we have fairly significant proportions of our population who cannot access core services. And I think online services, online delivery is often presented as an acceptable alternative in rural communities, but access to superfast broadband is not universally available across our region. And around a fifth of our residents still can't stream TV programmes or films without buffering, higher still in some of our rural communities. So ongoing rollout of broadband infrastructure through Scottish Government's R100 programme is absolutely critical. But nevertheless, the digital divide remains. And while urban parts of Scotland and other parts of the UK have moved the narrative on to ultra-fast broadband, some parts of our region still don't have access to superfast. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that. Housing, we all recognise that there's a housing crisis at the moment. It's a massive issue across Scotland and not just the Highlands and Islands. But housing is a critical enabler of economic development. It's key for population attraction and retention. In terms of our survey, while most residents were content with their own housing situation, we did see that younger people, those with children in the household and those on lower household incomes, were less likely to feel that their current housing situation meets their needs. There's a strength of feeling around the broader housing challenges that exist in local areas. And we see that it's fairly multifaceted. It's about availability of housing generally to rent and to buy. It's about the right type of housing. It's about affordability, second homes, holiday home ownership, Airbnb. So there's different factors of play. And for us, it is a pan-regional issue, although the challenges are certainly more acute in some parts of the region, and particularly remote rural and island communities. Interesting though to see the point around empty homes being brought back into use, and we are aware of some of our local authorities piloting schemes around this. The Western Isles Council is working with Pietka-Nykaza and the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership to purchase and refurbish empty homes, and Highlands Council have also introduced a pilot scheme, a new open market purchase scheme to buy directly from owners, just with a view to bolstering housing stock. But our housing challenges don't just relate to availability. Fuel poverty is much higher in our region than in other parts of Scotland. And around half of our households say their homes are expensive to heat, and about 17% that their homes are difficult to heat. So energy efficiency, enhancing energy efficiency in homes is really important right now, just in order to meet targets around fuel poverty, but also in terms of climate change and meeting targets around net zero. So what does that challenge look like for housing in our area? We still have a very strong reliance on fossil fuels. Around 13% are using green technology, and it's quite high in Orkney, but we have around 36% of households in Orkney using air source heat pumps. But generally, households, they're not ready to make that switch. They can't afford to make that switch, and that will have been exacerbated right now with the rising energy costs and the cost of living crisis that we're facing. Just moving on to transport. Our region also faces high levels of transport poverty, just defined as where people don't have access to essential services or work because of a lack of affordable transport options. It's no surprise, therefore, that there's a very high reliance on cars for day-to-day living, and it's higher still in remote parts of our region. So we have very high reliance on cars, but in our island communities too, there's a strong reliance on ferry services and, to a lesser extent, air services. Once again, thinking about that net zero journey and making that transition, it's very few of our households have purchased or leased electric or hybrid vehicles, and relatively few are planning to do so. The barriers reflect those that are seen nationally. It's about cost, it's range in a single charge, and it's a lack of public charging points. So to help accelerate this transition, and it is really important that we don't take an urban out approach to this, given the reliance we have on given the contribution that transport makes to carbon emissions. It's really critical that that infrastructure is in place to support that transition. Just thinking about our entrepreneurial people and culture, the National Strategy for Economic Transformation focuses on quality and availability of jobs, the importance of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial mindsets. Our findings show that our findings reflect the known employment structure in the region. We have a dominance of public sector employment and higher levels of self-employment, particularly in remote, rural and island areas. It's maybe also important to note that around a third of respondents working in the public sector reported that they'd moved to the region to take up a job. So such roles have a really critical role to play in supporting population attraction and retention. And it raises, again, the question of jobs dispersal and the role that that could play. Plurality of employment is common in our rural communities and more so amongst those that are self-employed. But for around half, it's driven by necessity. They have to rather than choose to. And that's particularly the case for those on the lowest incomes. Also interesting to consider working age population. We typically think of that as 16 to 64, but we also see that around 1 in 8 of our respondents are still working over the age of 65. They're still working, they're still contributing to their communities. And again, it's important to, I think, you know, we often talk about high dependency ratios, but it is important to just reflect on the contribution that the older members of our communities make. There's an appetite for self-employment among our regional residents. It's higher amongst men and newer residents. And there is a sense that new businesses are starting up in the local area. But what do we need to do to support that? Barriers include rising costs, lack of tradespeople, just help create the environment to help people to prepare to open up to self-employment, and some already have multiple jobs. They report that there's a lack of clarity and support available and need for tailored advice and support at all stages from people who actually understand their sector, understand their location. Just thinking about green jobs, and that was quite loosely defined as those, or as jobs that help the environment or help to prevent climate change, and around 1/5 of our residents would like such a job. There's also a recognition that current jobs will need to change in order to reduce carbon emissions, but around 1/4 feel it would be easy, but another 1 in 5 feel that it would be difficult for their jobs to adapt, particularly so for those working in transport, fisheries and health and social care. So what would that change look like for people making that transition? It brings the opportunity to work with new technology, but it also brings a requirement to invest in new tools, equipment, and the need to retrain. If we look at access to training, we do see that once again, there's an inequality that comes out, and almost 1/3 have felt that it's difficult to access courses or training in person, and 1 in 10 that it's even difficult to do so online. Those in our remote rural areas most likely to find it difficult to access training, both in person and online. And we found that income is also a constraint, with those on lower incomes less likely to be able to access training. If we move on to the whole concept of fair work, then we see relatively high levels of job satisfaction, but what jumps out here is low wages. We still have around half of our residents who are not paid the real living wage. So, you know, that's an area that we really need to think about in terms of better paid jobs, well-paid jobs across the whole of the region. But it's not all bad, and if we look at pride, if we look at participation, if we look at optimism, then we see a population that they're proud of their local area. They have very strong affinity. People are by no means queuing up to leave the Highlands and Islands. They want to stay, and I think it's really important to consider population retention and not just think about migration, but what is it we need to do to enable people to stay. And I think that's particularly important for young people, and our findings showed that over half want to be able to stay, they plan to stay, but for the others, it's about making sure they don't have to leave. Just to consider migration for those that have moved or moved to or moved back to the Highlands and Islands, what are the motivations? Lifestyle just jumps out. That was the top factor, and that's particularly so for those living in island and remote rural areas. In more urban parts of the region, it tends to be more associated with job opportunities. Migration, their views are quite varied around migration. And again, we see the complexity of the picture. We see that for some, they're seeing lots of retired people moving into their area. Others are seeing more people move to their local area because they can now work from home. So different ways of working have opened up opportunities. But the flip side of that is that almost half feel that people are leaving because they can't find work. But then too, we have almost a third that are moving for new job opportunities. So it's a very mixed picture in terms of migration. So what is it our communities need? What is it that they need to thrive? Housing jumps out as the key factor. Job opportunities, local businesses and trades, broadband infrastructure, more working age people moving into the area. And it does vary across our region. We do see
round up now, please, Catherine, because we're actually over time.
Yeah, I'm just coming on to my last slide after this one.
Thank you.
So broadly speaking, in the more populated parts of our region, there's a greater emphasis on job opportunities, jobs that pay better, and social activities. And in rural areas, infrastructure is of far greater significance, housing, broadband and transport, alongside more working age people. So just to conclude, what is it that we need to consider in terms of population attraction and retention? What needs to be addressed? The inequalities persist, particularly access to health services. We have housing challenges that need to be addressed. The digital divide, in terms of the net zero, transition to net zero, we need to move away from the reliance on fossil fuels and help improve household energy efficiency. We've got rising costs of living at the moment, and they are coming on top of existing high costs in some areas. So we need to diversify the economy, and we need to ensure a greater range of well-paid jobs across all parts of the region. Within that, we need sustained and flexible investment to address these inequalities. We need to ensure that the Highlands and Islands and rural regions across Scotland don't lag other parts of Scotland in terms of realising opportunity. And we need to ensure that the just is there in just transition to net zero. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to introduce Emilia's work here, as her research project provided the occasion for this workshop. And I'll be very brief about her biography, because there are longer biographies circulated with the agenda of all our speakers. But she's a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of West of Scotland. And her research expertise is in the field of migration studies, with a particular focus on the theme of integration and migrant settlement practices from a multidisciplinary and policy-focused perspective. And certainly one of the things I really enjoyed about her paper is that while it looks at migration in the rural living context, it takes that in quite a broad way. But I'll hand over to you now, Emilia.
Thank you, Sarah and Rebecca, for organising such a nice event, and thank you previous presenters for very interesting presentation, so that will be some crossover between what I will be focusing on today and previous presenters. So this part of the event will really focus on key findings from the project that was looking at the rural living among migrant and non-migrant communities in Scotland. So very briefly about the research, our field work was in a Marif Firth area, and we did the online semi-structured interviews with diverse rural stayers, and these people include EU nationals. It also include internal migrants, so people of UK nationality who actually moved to Highlands and Islands, and also people who were born and raised in Highlands. And our interviews focus on experiences of living in the area, but also we focus on the different routines that people do have in relation to workplace, household, leisure activities, but also how they perceive the community in which they are living in. And because today's event is really focused on retention of the population, what I will do is primarily focus on the experience of staying. And I will try to address the question why people stay in the area and what are the factors that can contribute to that process or undermine that process. So to understand staying, within our project, we applied the conceptual framework that I developed with my colleagues. And how we did understand staying is ongoing practice that is being developed over the time, that can be shaped incrementally, can be facilitated or undermined by particular dimensions, and these dimensions includes assets. And when we talk about assets, we talk about different forms of capital. It can be tangible, like housing, education, or health, or intangible assets like social connections. The link life, and this dimension refers to significant people that actually have an impact on people's decision to stay, and these are particularly family members. And course refers to sense of belonging, and changing people, changing life refers to physical place in which people live and how it have an impact on people's decision to stay. So what were the assets that our participants identify as a key in terms of facilitating daily staying experiences? And these are very similar to what already Catherine presented. These include education, employment, housing, but also closeness to the natural landscape, but also social connections. So how these assets impact the staying and how these assets actually can facilitate people's experience of staying and what are the risks. Education, high quality of education for children was one of the key assets that motivate people to move in or stay in the area. And I think that there is a lot of similarity between our findings and what Catherine already presented. And opportunity to for children to continue their education with the same peers over their primary and secondary sector was perceived as a very important added value of living in the rural places. But also families tend to stay, not to disturb children education. So that those rural areas without close proximity of the primary education were seen as not really attractive, but also the presence of this school in the community have very strong impact on the social relations, and I will be talking about it later on. Employment was the source of material security. However, within our research, we find ethnic clustering within labour market would then have an impact on co-ethnic relations within the workplace. Lack of career opportunities, that has been said already, but also with our participants were either in the risk of the poverty or experiencing of poverty, and particularly those who actually were in low-skilled jobs. Housing opportunities, we heard that. So those people who actually were house owners that really attach them to the place. But we already talk about risk around housing and issues around housing in rural places. And other assets we haven't maybe been mentioned, but our participants really valued the access to the natural landscape and being able to have more balanced life outside of the busy and congested areas. But the access to diversity of the natural landscapes is quite often related to people just having their own cars, private cars, but then with increasing prices of fuel, that might have an impact on the accessibility of diversity of natural landscapes. And the final and very important things which haven't been mentioned yet are the social connections. And social networks and connections that the people develop are very important source of instrumental support, emotional support, but also I think for particular context of rural places, they were very important in terms of providing welfare services. Having said that, lack of confidence or language skills prevent people to actually have a wide range of social connections. But also full-time employment, and particularly for those people who lower skill jobs where we've seen the ethnic clustering, they limit really the opportunity to have a social connection only with ethnic others. Moving further, so what were the important people who have an impact on people's decision of staying? These were children, parents, and partners. So how they impact the decision of staying in the rural context. Children and moving to rural areas were quite often linked with parents' desire to raise their children in a safe and small community. And also, having children was also a pivotal point for making decisions to stay long-term, not to disturb children peer-to-peer relations or children education. But also, which is very interesting, having children opened the doors for many of participants, particularly those who were newcomers, to start and develop new social relations through different child-focused activities or through school, which was very, very important. Parents, some participants decided to stay in rural to look after their elderly parents. And partners and decision, actually, quite often decision to stay with move is quite often in relation with partner place of origin or change of employment, and that is quite gendered with women following their partners. And this is maybe not really a risk by doesn't have a place to where to put it. But when you consider maybe people's decision of staying, what we really find in our research is quite often it really depends on decision of the whole family, whole household, and calculation of the whole family and household financial position, perception, and opportunities and well-being, rather than individuals. So in terms of maybe retaining the population, we could perhaps apply wider view in terms of looking into perspective of whole household and family desires and well-being. In terms of sense of belonging, it's not as perhaps a surprise that biodiversity of economic and social ties really root our participants within that community that they were living, but also the perception of the rural community as being less dense but also safe was also important factor for our participants in terms of their sense of belonging. But we also find that numerous of risks which hinder the sense of belonging of our participants. And that was social isolation. A lot of them actually experience social isolation. We also find experience of discrimination and xenophobia, which was quite directed both to international and internal migrants. But also the perception of rural community being reserved, maybe not really engaging in the father and friendly social encounters, which really limited the opportunity for more in-depth and strong ties among the rural communities. And finally, there were numerous of places that has been identified by our participants that either help in terms of developing new social relations, strengthen the existing social relations within the community, which then have an impact on the sense of belonging. And these were quite a lot of them. But for people with children, school was one of the key places which facilitate developing of the new social relations. And that was because school premises, I'm not only talking about the class, but also the drop-off area, is the place where people meet regularly regularly over the longer period of time, so for at least 7 years if it's primary sector. And that actually helped for developing friendship, but also fleeting and social encounters. And these social relations quite often go beyond the school premises, to park after the school or to home. So the proximity of the school is very, very important here, because for those people who actually drop the children to school driving, they miss quite a lot of opportunities to mingle around the drop-off area, or even just having a casual conversation while you're walking. And also the drop-off and pick-up system is a little bit different for primary and secondary sector, and that was highlighted by the service providers in terms of having an impact on engagement with parents. Parks were also a form of social animators, because people tend to interact through play dates, picnics, walks. So again, proximity of the park has an impact on access to those places. And whether schools and parks were places where quite often the new social relation has been developed, community halls and leisure centers were the places where the existing relations has been maintained. And this is because community hall or community centers offer dedicated organized activities for interest groups. But also because of actually they offer dedicated activities to particular interest groups, they already exclude other people, which for some participants, they might see this is not relevant for them. Leisure centers provide a very important contribution in terms of maintaining general health and well-being of the population by providing diversity of sport activities. But again, all of our participants get to leisure center driving. So increasing fuel prices might have an impact in terms of the access to those places. Natural landscape, again, had a very important role in terms of maintaining the well-being of our participants. It also offers a wide opportunity for activities which are free of charge, but again, you can access it through your own way of transport because of the scarcity of the public transport. So for people who actually did not own their own car, that was the access to diversity of rural landscape was quite limited. Few other places which I would like to mention: church, another physical space where people had regular routine opportunity to meet, and because of those regular opportunities to meet for a longer period of time, it helps developing social relations. But on the other side, what we noticed that provision of services within the church in other than English language contribute to internal division and ethnic divisions within the rural community. Also, the change of the profile of the church membership over the time may contribute to feeling of just not belonging to that community anymore. and also there is a potential tension between different religious groups. Another important place within the rural are different shops and cafes and businesses, and these quite often are an etiquette of the heritage of the local community, and also these places are where local businesses coexist with the bigger supermarkets or ethnic services, which very nicely represent and visualize the existence of the rural cosmopolitanism. However, the fact that people again overrely on their own private transport to get to that place kind of limit the opportunity for people just to mingle on the streets. Another important place is home. It's home where the people maintain their personal, intimate relations. But those relations, what we find out in our research, are primarily mono-ethnic and mono-nationals, which potentially identify the existing divisions with the rural communities. And the final place is a workplace, is for those people who work full time. You spend most of the time in your workplace. So the fact that we find ethnic division within the local labor market, it really is the opportunity for people to develop co-ethnic social relations. So to summarize what it means really, what those factors, what those experience means. So our study finds multiple overlapping elements that facilitate staying of our participants in rural places. And again, it kind of I highlight the importance, which already Ruth and Catherine did, importance of the access to education, but also employment and housing. But also we find the importance of social connections that really root people in the area. We also find that really the decision of staying in rural is quite often is not individual decision. It's being influenced by the needs and decisions of other close members of the families. So people may stay in a rural area, not just because they want, it's just because it's good for the family, it's good for their children, it's good, their partner find a work there. We also identify numerous of places which played a very important role in terms of facilitating social encounters, and I think that hasn't been mentioned already. So these are the good things that we find out. We also find potential risks that's already been mentioned around assets. So limited access to housing, low pay employment, experience of poverty, but also limited social connections are potential risks that might push people out from the rural places. Sense of belonging was undermined by the perception, it was particularly for the people who moved to the area. So sense of their belonging was undermined by the perception of rural community being reserved, not really engaging, social isolation, but also form of discrimination and verbal abuse. And finally, the access to the places which are important are limited by the perception of the place of not being welcoming, or perception of the place is just not, it's not for me, it's not relevant, or proximity of the place, and finally transport facilities.